Member for Malvern.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Somebody who spent many years in the practice of law before being elected to Parliament, for me the test of a bill and the powers it contains is whether it has the potential to be abused and whether there are sufficient checks and balances to prevent that abuse from happening. Because, Deputy Speaker, this is the point. Sometimes bad people get elected to parliaments. Sometimes weak people get elected to parliaments. Sometimes circumstances turn people who are otherwise good, they turn good people with power into people who make bad and wrong decisions. And whether you think that the current Andrews Labor government is made up of good people or bad people, or strong people or weak people, the point of this bill is that the extraordinary powers it gives will be available to every future government. Every future government. Now, Deputy Speaker, why has this bill been rushed through? Rushed through. It was introduced on Tuesday. We didn't see it. It was second read on Wednesday. We saw it for the first time. And now the government's going to guillotine it through, ram it through the Legislative Assembly on Thursday. These are some of the most far-reaching powers that any Premier, any Minister for Health will have had in this state's history, and yet the government is doing everything it can to avoid proper scrutiny. When we saw the head of Liberty Victoria calling this out, Liberty Victoria President Julia Kretzenbacher said she did not support the bill being rushed through Parliament and insisted that the new laws must be carefully scrutinised by MPs and the public. When you lose Liberty Victoria, when a Labor government loses Liberty Victoria, you're losing the room. You are losing the room. So this government is rushing this through. No doubt there'll be a closure motion put at some stage, and the many Liberal and Nationals MPs and other MPs who want to speak on this won't be given that chance. What has the government got to hide? If you think this bill stacks up, if you think this bill is right, if you think the balance is there, why aren't you going to allow it to be properly debated? Normally a bill of this magnitude would be given at least 2 weeks of discussion and debate in the community before we debate it in this place. The government's refused to do this. Now, it's not as though you didn't know this bill was coming. The current state of emergency was extended about 8 months ago. You always knew it was going to end on the 15th of December. So why wasn't this bill out there for weeks for discussion and debate? Now, we know that the government hasn't consulted properly because the government admitted it itself. When the Health Minister's leaked bill summary came out on Monday night, it says consultation has not been extensive as it normally would be. So the government admits it has not consulted extensively on this far-reaching and extraordinary bill. Why is that? We know it hasn't been consulted. The opposition weren't consulted. The crossbench and the other place weren't consulted, with the exception of the 3 reliable pro-Labor votes, who are the only ones allowed inside the tent: the Greens Party, the Reason Party and the Animal Justice Party. Everyone else has been kept in the dark and treated like mushrooms. Oppositions, independents and Victorians, more importantly. The government claimed it had consulted with the Victorian Bar Council. Did it really? Here's what the Victorian Bar President, Christopher Blandon QC, said. He said it's a gross misrepresentation. He said, "We've never seen a bill. We've never been asked to comment or anything." This is consultation? Now, why this matters, Deputy Speaker, is because this is a bill that contains massive power with little to no oversight and little to no checks or balances. Powers to detain you. That's usually what courts do. Courts usually sentence people to detention. Now public servants can do it under this bill. And if you're detained and you want to appeal that, do you get to go to court? No, you don't. Section 165BI provides that you get to make an application to the Secretary of the Department for a review by a detention review officer. It's a very Orwellian term, isn't it? A detention review officer. Something you find in 1984 shouldn't be in the legislation statute books of a state like Victoria. The ancient legal principle of habeas corpus seems to have been axed as well. Why aren't people being brought before courts to have their detention reviewed instead of more bureaucrats, more public servants? The privilege against self-incrimination, an ancient privilege, has been removed by this bill. So we know there are massive powers to detain you, to stop you from opening your business, to stop you from leaving your home, to stop you from going to your church or your mosque or your synagogue or your temple. Where's the accountability? Where are the checks and balances on this massive power? Well, Section 165CE of the bill provides for the establishment of an independent pandemic management advisory committee. Well, the first clue to it being a toothless tiger is in the name. It's an advisory committee. Advisory. Then if you had any further doubt, look at Section 165CF. It makes clear the functions of the committee include to prepare and provide reports to the minister, including, but not limited to, reports that make non-binding recommendations. We're supposed to believe that our liberties, our rights will be safeguarded by a committee appointed by the government that can only make non-binding recommendations. Deputy Speaker, I tell you what, a non-binding recommendation and $4, that'll buy you a coffee. And that's about all a non-binding recommendation is good for. Or, of course, you could look at the Scrutiny of Acts and Regulations Committee. The government says, we've given provision to SARC to be able to look at these pandemic management orders and see if they're appropriate or not. I tell you what this government thinks of SARC. This bill before us today didn't even go through SARC. It was bypassed entirely. That's how powerful SARC is. That's how much respect this Labor government has for the Scrutiny of Acts and Regulations Committee. It was inconvenient to put this bill before SARC, so it just ignored it. Absolutely ignored it. And we're supposed to put our faith and confidence that our rights and liberties will be safeguarded through this process. It's not just been the usual suspects, Deputy Speaker, who've expressed real concerns about this bill. Associate Professor William Bartlett from Melbourne Law School pointed out some of the flaws in this bill, and I'll quote. He says, "In one critical way, however, the bill rejects a key parliamentary safeguard that is used in New South Wales and New Zealand. Instead of creating a dedicated cross-party parliamentary committee to oversee the exercise of these broad public health powers, it creates an executive-appointed oversight committee for this purpose. The use of an appointed committee to oversee these powers is a problematic departure from the usual role of parliamentary committees in the scrutiny of executive government. To ensure a full set of safeguards, dedicated parliamentary oversight should be created alongside that of an appointed committee." So that's the legal academic view of things. You could go to the less legal academic view of things and go to the chairman of the Victorian Bar Council, who was quoted in The Age saying, "Stasi police would have been more than happy with the range of powers if they were given it." Mr Blandon told The Age, "It's extraordinary." When you see that the government has the power to make laws depending on people's attributes, you have to go back to the Equal Opportunity Act to see what those attributes are. It can include things like marital status, lawful sexual activity, sexual orientation, industrial activity. If the government doesn't intend to use those attributes as a means of discriminating against people, why have it in the bill? It would have been the simplest thing to say these are the only attributes we want to be able to discriminate against, maybe your vaccination status, for example. But the government hasn't done that. It's given itself the power to discriminate against people for effectively any reason it feels like it, and it's not good enough. Deputy Speaker, at the end of the day, it comes down to trust. This government is asking the people of Victoria to trust them with the most extraordinary set of powers and next to no oversight and no accountability for using them. Trust. Trust from a Premier who couldn't recall 23 times on one day before the Coate inquiry. Trust from a government that caused the second wave, the 801 deaths that eventuated through its own mismanagement of hotel quarantine. Trust from a government that has not been straight with Victorians this entire pandemic. Deputy Speaker, the trust credit is gone. Victorians don't trust the government. We shouldn't be passing legislation which gives an untrustworthy government even more power, and I oppose this bill.